So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Mazel Tov again to Hannah and to Barry. You bring honor to us all. Our Parsha this week is quite unique in a number of different ways. It represents a shift from the usual, a change from what we have come to expect when engaging with Torah. Parshat Balak begins from the perspective of those who are not Israelites. Now, understandably, most of the Torah is told from the point of view of our people, our community. And seldom do we see the points of view of other peoples written into the text so clearly. And so some scholars suggest that this should be our cue. This should be our ears should perk up. We should really lean in and pay special attention, for a change in modality is often a sign of something larger happening. And at the beginning of Parshat Balak, we are told that the Balak, the king of Moab, has seen how numerous the Israelites are and has seen how they have soundly defeated all of their previous enemies. And so consequently, Balak, as it is written, dreaded the Israelites and sent for Balaam, the prophet, the diviner, to curse the Israelites as a way of defeating them and driving them out of the land. And from the very beginning, Balak's plans run into difficulties. The very first night that the envoy arrives at Balaam's home to invite him to Balak's court, God visits Balaam in a dream, sternly forbidding him from cursing the Israelites. And Balaam awakes and tells the emissaries, "I cannot do anything big nor small, contrary to the command of my God Adonai." Strange words from someone who's not an Israelite. Yet despite God's warnings, despite Balaam's declaration, he still prepares to follow through with Balak's request to curse the Israelites. He constructs 7 altars and sacrifices many animals as an offering to inspire a favorable outcome. Not so much for us. It would have looked to Balak that his wishes were about to be fulfilled. But when Balaam returns to the Moabite king, he has only brought blessings for the Israelites and repeats the phrase, "How can I doom when Adonai has not doomed?" Naturally, Balak is angered by this result. He hired Balaam to curse the Israelites, not bless them. He decides a change in location will change the outcome. And again, altars are erected, animals are sacrificed, and Balaam returns again with a blessing for the Israelites. This pattern repeats a total of 3 times throughout our narrative. And Balak angrily confronts Balaam, but Balaam replies that he has said to the emissaries, and he has done just as he said to Balak when he arrived at the court. Balaam could only decree what God permitted Balaam to say. If this week's Parsha could be summed up in a single word, let it be stubbornness. We learn lessons about inflexibility, not giving way, the stalemates that only come to an end when one side's sheer force wins out over another's. This is particularly evident in what is perhaps the Torah's most unusual biblical account, and yes, I agree, Rabbi, very much a comedy, complete with a false prophet, a mysterious angel of God, and a talking donkey. We find that Balaam, in the employ of the king, is so determined to curse the Jewish people that he ferociously beats his donkey again and again and again. After the donkey, as our bar mitzvah noted, is an animal that the Midrash claims has demonstrated nothing but complete obedience, nothing but loyalty all the days of her life up to this point. And the donkey uncharacteristically stops in her tracks due to the presence of God's angel. Now, common sense would have told Balaam that something really must have been out of sorts for the donkey to act so out of character. Yet, his grim persistence to curse blinds his ability to recognize that which is truly going on around him. Ultimately, we know Balaam does not offer curses, but instead his words are transformed within his very mouth and speaks the familiar blessing, Ma tovu o'alecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael, how good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. This represents a radical change, a paradigm shift of Balaam's function in the narrative. In a way, we can say that his stubbornness is overcome, and Balaam becomes the bringer of blessings. In Jewish ritual practice, we too experience change throughout the ages. We hold in each of our hands two very important concepts, that of keva and kavanah. Keva representing this fixed practice, and kavanah representing the intention that we bring to the keva. The late Rabbi Jacob Pedakowski put it best. One generation's expression of kavanah becomes the next generation's heritage of keva. In other words, what was once new and even revolutionary can become solidified, custom and practice. And we remind ourselves that at one point everything, even the revelation at Sinai, was new. And as Reform Jews, we embrace the truth that there is nothing wrong with changing our modes and our styles. In fact, it is often a blessing. The great halachist of Sfat, Yosef Karo, reminds us, rather a little prayer with intention than much without it. One of the most common utterances in any Jewish organization, whether it be a large shul, a nonprofit organization, or an independent minyan, we often hear said, well, this is the way we've always done it. Just as in The Fiddler on the Roof, people often don't remember why they have the traditions they do or know where they came from in the first place, but God help us if we try to change them. Some might argue that Judaism is meant to be a religion of unrelenting tradition, unyielding consistency. Yet at the core of Holy Blossom Temple, there is a moving embrace of innovation and adaptability in all of our Jewish endeavors. This has been true over the past 2 years of pandemic, but even more profoundly, this has been true over the last 100 years of our Reform affiliation and identity. Israel Abrahams, the preeminent scholar of his age, once wrote, "The formulation of the highest truth needs constant revision, and even surely do the forms in which that truth is clothed. A liturgy that cannot expand, that cannot absorb the best religious teachings of the age, that cannot dare to sing unto the Lord new songs, is a printed page, not a prayer book for the supplicant's heart." And with this teaching in our mind, let us take a moment of gratitude for the gift that is Siddur Pirkei Kodesh. Our prayer book is a religious and ethical inheritance of our community. This Shabbat, I encourage you to explore the Siddur beyond the pages of the Shabbat worship services and find that we at Holy Blossom dare to sing new songs to Adonai, all while honoring our beloved tradition. One of the great scholars of the Jewish people, Maimonides, or Rambam, was once considered so polarizing, so divisive, and was so hated by so many of his own fellow Jewish people that in the winter of 1232, one group of Spanish rabbis actually had the audacity to hand over copies of his great work, the Guide for the Perplexed, to Dominican priests so that the copies could be burned. And what caused such visceral hatred, such anger towards members of our tribe? The Rambam's great crime was that he thought differently. He loved philosophy and sought to explain the Tanakh and Talmud in rational, philosophical terms. And for many, this was far beyond the pale of what could be tolerated. For them, Maimonides' works were pure heresy. And ironically enough, It was someone who saw the world in completely opposite terms who became one of Rambam's fiercest defenders. Moses ben Nachman, more famously known as Nachmanides, was a much more mystic thinker and had no problem criticizing Maimonides' opinions or worldviews. But he always defended Maimonides' right to state them because he saw their inherent value. Nachmanides knew that if it were not for the writings and commentary of his theological opponent, a multitude of Jews would forever leave the fold. Just as Balaam finally relented and gave way to the angel, and just as Nachmanides had the foresight to see that the future, perhaps the very survival of the Jewish people, lay in respecting and including a format that was different, that had changed from his own belief system, so too must we in our own time recognize and accept the fact that even though there are forms of tefillah and limud and kehillah, of prayer and study and community that might not be familiar to us or may even make us uncomfortable, they may indeed hold in them the future of Am Yehudi, the Jewish people. 2 years ago, we could have never considered holding our daily minyanim entirely online. Prior to COVID, bringing a professional videographer to a cemetery would have been so beyond the pale of appropriate that we could not even consider it as a possibility. And when we had the ability to safely gather in this sacred space with the full strength of the community present, could you imagine the discomfort if a clergy member asked you, chas v'chalila, to take out your cell phone and send a Shabbat Shalom message to someone? Yet today, responding to the needs of our age, we as a Jewish community gather almost entirely in front of our individual screens. And we do this with respect for our heritage and complete integrity as Jews, for we understand our needs and we see the merits of change. As I was preparing for this Shabbat, I spent some time in Chavruta with a good friend of mine to speak about theories of change. He reminded me how an intentional change in behavior is almost always preceded by a change in thinking. He then shared with me a parable of a Mexican fisherman. Perhaps some are familiar with it. It goes like this. A businessman was visiting a small coastal Mexican village and saw a fisherman with 3 yellowfin tuna and asked him, "How long did it take you to catch these?" The fisherman replied it only took a few hours and that it was enough to feed his family. The businessman then asked him, what did he do for the rest of the day? And the fisherman replied, "Well, I sleep in late, I fish for a little, I play with my children, I take a siesta with my wife, and in the evenings I stroll into town where I sip wine and play guitar with my amigos. I have a full and busy life." And the businessman scoffed. "Today is your lucky day. I have an MBA from Harvard and I could help you. Here's what you got to do. Spend more time fishing and save your money to go buy a bigger boat. And with the proceeds from the bigger boat, you can buy several boats. Eventually, you would have a fleet of fishing boats, and instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you would sell directly to the processor and eventually open up your own cannery in Mexico City. You would control the product, processing, and distribution." The fisherman asked, "How long will this take?" To which the businessman replied, 15, 20 years tops." "But what then?" The businessman laughed. He said, "That's the best part. When the time is right, you could announce your IPO and sell your company's stock to the public and become very, very rich. You would make millions." And the fisherman smiled. "Millions? Then what?" The businessman said, "Then you could retire, and you could move from Mexico City to a small coastal fishing village where you could sleep in, fish a little during the day, play with your kids, take a siesta with your wife, and stroll to the village in the evenings where you could sip wine and play guitar with your friends. Yes, change requires preparation and deep thought. Yet this parable teaches us that there are certainly moments for changing our behavior, and then there are moments for changing our mindset. As many of us make preparations to transition back into our new post-COVID normal, if we can call it that, we should keep this fisherman in mind. And as a cautionary tale, we should keep in mind Balak, that we should strive for our goals, but we must also be aware that things change, sometimes quickly and often slowly. Even as we make great positive strides forward, the path of this pandemic is not always linear. It may be tempting to curse the way things are at this moment. We might want to rail against what we have lost or what we have not been able to gain. But there are so many opportunities to be had as well. As we strive for our new normal, we also have the freedom to innovate new solutions to old problems, to have more of a determining hand in what that new normal will be. Instead of cursing what is before us, let us instead look for the blessings that we might gain. Shabbat Shalom.